Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday night worship. You may notice something a little bit different about tonight. As I was reading through chapter 7, and also as I was reading through chapter 8, a thought occurred to me. We have been doing teaching first and then music second, because back when we were in the Psalms, the best way, in my opinion, to react to what's going on in the Psalms is to sing songs, right? To sing psalms back to God. As we've been in Amos, particularly in these two chapters, 7 and 8, it's occurred to me it doesn't feel right after judgment to kind of sing songs. And you may disagree with me on this, and that's okay. But I think for at least these 2 weeks, it'll be good for us to sing our faith first as a way of putting ourselves in the right headspace, the right heart space, to hear these very hard words from the prophet Amos. And so again, we flip-flopped it again. Sheldon will present some music and some worship for us first as we sort of put our hearts in the right place before God. And then after that, we will move into the teaching time where hopefully our hearts have been prepared to listen to what God has to say through this prophet, not only to the people of history, but to us as well. So thank you for joining us tonight. Music is first, and so I'm going to hand it over to Sheldon. He's going to play some music for us, and then we'll get back into the teaching after our music time.
Water you turned into wine. Open the eyes of the blind. There's no one like you. None like you. Into the darkness you shine. Out of the ashes we rise. There's no one like you. None like you. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Water you turned into wine. Open the eyes of the blind. There's no one like you. None like you. Into the darkness you shine. Out of the ashes we rise. There's no one like you. None like you. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. And if our God is for us, then who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, then what could stand against? And if our God is for us, then who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, what could stand against? What could stand against? Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. give your heart. Come just as you are to worship. Come just as you are before your God. Come. One day every tongue will confess you are God. One day every knee will bow. Still the greatest treasure remains for those who gladly choose you now. Come, now is the time to worship. Come, now is the time to give your heart. Come, just as you are to worship. Come, just as you are before your God. Come. Willingly we choose to surrender our lives. Willingly our knees will bow. With all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, we gladly choose you now. Come, now is the time to worship. Come, now is the time to give your heart. Come, just as you are to worship. Come, just as you are before your God. Come, come, come. I could just sit and wait for all your goodness, hope to feel your presence. I could just stay right where I am and hope to feel you, hope to feel something again. I could hold on to who I am and never let you change me from the inside. I could be safe, oh, I could be safe here in your arms and never leave home, never let these walls down. But you have called me higher, you have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. You have called me higher, you have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. You lead me. You lead me, Lord. I could hold on to who I am and never let you change me from the inside. I could be safe, oh, I could be safe here in your arms and never leave home, never let these walls down. You have called me higher, you have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. You have called me higher. You have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. You lead me. You lead me, Lord. I will be yours, oh, I will be yours for all my life. I will be yours, oh, I will be yours for all my life. I will be yours, oh, I will be yours for all my life, so let your mercy. I will be yours, Lord, I will be yours for all my life, so let your mercy light the path before me. You have called me higher, you have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. You have called me higher, you have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. 'Cause you have called me higher, you have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. 'Cause you have called me higher, you have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. You lead me. You lead me, Lord. You lead me. You lead me, Lord.
All right, so hopefully our PowerPoint is back up. Hopefully you can see what's going on the screen. I apologize for last week. I noticed I went halfway through the first section without actually putting it on the first slide, so my apologies for last week. This week, chapter 8, we're nearing the end, folks. It's 8 and 9, and then we're out. And things are not getting better. I've entitled this this lecture Endgame. We're in the end. We're in the end game. Things are drawing to a close, and it's not looking good for the people of Israel. So it was your homework, as every week, to read the next chapter. But please, if you haven't read chapter 8, press pause on your computer, your television, your smartphone, whatever you're using. Read chapter 8. It's only 17 verses long. You can do it. It might only be 14. Yeah, it's only 14. 7 was 17 verses. This is only 14 easy verses. You can read them, but please, I want you to have the context before we move on and move through, because we're commenting on the text largely. All right, so moving on into chapter 8. So if you recall from last week, we began with a series of 3 visions, locust, fire, and then a plumb line. Went into some kind of narrative stuff about Jeroboam and Amaziah telling Amos to go and make himself scarce in Israel and go back to Judah and do his thing there. And here we return in chapter 8 with a final vision from this chapter. And the vision that Amos sees, God, gives this vision and asks Amos, what do you see? And Amos says something to the effect of a basket of ripe fruit or a basket of summer fruit. The language there we don't really know. These are kind of phrases that are not used very much in the scriptures, so we don't know exactly what they mean in context. But this basket of fruit. So if we go back to 7, we have 2 of the visions that were very sort of, this is the type of judgment that God's going to bring, and then a third vision that says, this is why God's going to bring judgment. Once again, that's what's going on here. There is a vision, and it's not a, this is going to happen. It's a vision saying, this is why things are going to happen. Now, ultimately, God says what's going to happen, right? The Lord is no longer going to pass the people of Israel by. God is no longer going to ignore what they're doing. He is no longer going to forestall judgment on the people of Israel. How a basket of ripe fruit correlates to that, I am not entirely sure. Now, I heard it said once that no, I'm not going to say that. Sometimes, right, when fruit is ripe and ready to eat, you want to eat it because it's going to spoil the next day. Now, I don't know if that correlates. I don't know if God's maybe saying, look, the time is coming. It's ripe for judgment now, right? This cannot hold another day before it is executed. I don't really know what's going on there. What is clear, however, is God gives the interpretation, right? Amos sees a basket of summer fruit. Presumably, the people who are hearing this in its original context know what's going on, know how this correlates, right? Right? We might say an elephant never forgets, and in posterity, that may not click with people, right? So a basket of summer fruit doesn't click with us, but it probably did to the original hearers. But God is saying, the time is up, judgment is coming, I will no longer forestall judgment on the people of Israel. It is happening, and it is happening now or soon. I cannot put this off any longer. The time is, the language of the time is ripe for my people Israel, and I will spare them no longer. And so then God begins to describe what's going on, right? What it looks like, what that judgment is going to look like. And basically what he says is that they're going to turn their dancing into mourning, right? We hear in the scriptures occasionally, right? God will turn their mourning into dancing. But here, God's going to turn their dancing into mourning. It's interesting because you have, again, that vision, if you recall a couple weeks ago, this complacency of the people. They're sitting by the beach drinking Mai Tais, right? Everything's good. Everything is awesome. Nothing could go wrong. And so all of a sudden, that kind of complacent, everything's good, is going to be turned into deep, deep lament. In fact, what the prophet says is there's going to be dead bodies everywhere. Leave it to Amos to be chipper and joyful. Dead bodies everywhere is not a happy image. But again, this is not, for readers of Amos, this is not a surprising image. This has been throughout. God just keeps coming back with this image. Israel's got to die. Israel's got to die. Israel's got to die. And while the people could maybe understand being punished or being told they're wrong, they could not imagine death for Israel. They could not imagine a future in which Israel was not a part. But God is saying, it's bad. I cannot stand by any longer. I cannot extend any more grace. I cannot extend any more mercy. Judgment is here. And in the presence of that judgment, be quiet. That's really what it says, right? The NIV says, the songs in the temple were turned to wailing. Many, many bodies flung everywhere. Silence. Now, if that's not a very good sentence, Sheldon can comment on the English structure of that sentence. It is very staccato. Bodies flung everywhere. Silence. Silence in horror, or silence before the judgment of God. Sometimes I wonder if the most powerful noise in the world is no noise at all. Right? The most fearful noise to us moderns is not lots of noise all around us. It is silence. And so I don't know if God is commanding silence. Judgment is coming, so just be quiet. Or maybe God is commanding Amos to silence. Amos, You have pled for the lives of the people before. Now, silence. Or, bodies everywhere, it's over, period, full stop, silence. In any case, whatever the referent of that silence is, it's not good. It is not the silence of wonder, of joy. We're not lost in wonder and praise. The people are lost in fear and dread. The silence is cause for fear and concern, not joy. This is God coming in judgment, not God coming to save.
This is a pretty heavy place to start this discussion. So to add a little bit of levity, I would say these verses are in competition, but do you have any other passages of Scripture that you would say would best fit into a death metal / screamo song better than this one?
On here. Bodies everywhere, silence, right? Yeah. Yeah, I got nothing else. I mean, this is visceral. It's hardcore. It is, again, I think that the sentence structure obviously is rendered differently in English, so I couldn't comment too much on how the sentence structure is rendered in Hebrew, but again, it's I like the way the English, because it's there. It's like gunfire. Do, right? Blood, guts, silence. That's what it sounds like. So yeah, I would, as I know you've already taken time to reflect, but even more time to reflect on this, and the question maybe Sheldon can pop up before all this, because I'm answering it before we've done is, what's your reaction to that? I mean, Sheldon talked, it feels like death metal, right? Just right? It's grating, it's hard to hear, but yeah, to me it sounds sort of like the worst of beat poetry, right? Like, or new wave poetry, like, bodies everywhere, silence, right? I mean, just like it's uncomfortable. I mean, I don't often prefer the NIV to the New Revised Standard. I just tend to like the New Revised Standard better. But here I really like the way the NIV has rendered this, because it's uncomfortable and it's cringeworthy, and I think it should be. It needs to be. That's the point. We ought to be cringing at this, because it is blood and guts stuff. There is nothing held back here by God. And that if it helps us to realize the gravity of this situation, then it's done its job. Because this is grave. This is not happy-go-lucky stuff. This is serious. And I think the language, especially in NIV, right? The songs in the temple will turn to mourning. Many, many bodies flung everywhere. Silence. Read it in the NIV. I mean, even the way it's written, like on the page, it's just like it's a horrible sentence. Right? Many, 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 comma, many bodies, dash, flung everywhere, exclamation point, silence, exclamation point. Right? Your English lesson for the day is there's no verb in that sentence. But it's off-putting, it's grating, and it should be. So with that joy, let's move on. So the question we might be left with is, but why? God, why all of this? Why is this happening? Now, we've got the first seven chapters of Amos to tell us why, but the prophet comes around again and talks about why. And the first kind of thing that he begins to talk about, he basically describes the people who are waiting on Sabbath days. They're waiting. They're not working because they're good people. But on Sabbath days, they're plotting how to defraud people in the marketplace the next day. When will the new moon be over so that we can go and have dishonest measure and have fake containers or padded containers so that people don't get as much as they pay for? How can we do this? How can we exploit the poor? How can we do this? How can we do that? It's crazy because Amos says, you think you're righteous by celebrating the Sabbath, and yet on the Sabbath you're plotting the very things that the Sabbath is meant to forestall. The Sabbath is meant to give people rest, to provide justice for those who are working day in and day out. The Sabbath is a time to reflect and listen to God, and the people, how Amos describes it on the Sabbath, are plotting the very evil that the Sabbath is meant to counter. Right? It's like sitting in church going, how can I commit sin today? That's what's going on. On the Sabbath, they're thinking, how can I commit sin tomorrow? Their desire for profit leads to exploitation. And while they may not see it in these ways, they're injustice. They're seeking injustice for their own profit. And in so doing, they are violating the very just world and society that God has created for Israel to model and to live into. And so God's saying, why am I going to destroy? Think about it. You can't even see your way out of a paper bag. You can't even pause to worship me, and you are so unreflective that on the day you are called to worship Yahweh God, you are plotting ways to defraud your neighbor. Whew. That's harsh. And I want to say with all of this, lest we think we can stand and be like, wow, they're bad people. This is meant for us to hear too. We need to take this seriously. In what ways might we be doing that? I don't know if that's Sheldon's question, but we may be doing that our own ways. Taking the time reserved for reflection, for worship, to plot ways to do evil to our neighbor, even if we wouldn't say it that way. Crazy. In that statement, there's actually 7 accusations, talking about numbers, Sheldon, as we did last week, right? Does 3 mean anything? Well, here's 7. Most biblical people are going, well, when there's 7 things mentioned and then some sort of judgment or some sort of conclusion out of that, 7's the number of perfection. Things don't generally happen on accident. It's not like Amos ran out of things to say, or that there's exactly 7 things that are wrong with the people of Israel, right? There's probably intentional that there's 7 accusations made, 7 being completion or fullness, right? The time has come, the time is right for judgment on Israel. Their injustice, their wickedness has reached its fullness. People are supposed to be models of righteousness, but their injustice has reached its full number, and the time is right for God to bring judgment. And so Amos goes on to say that God will swear by the pride of Jacob, make an oath by the pride of Jacob, never to forget the sins of Israel. Okay, a couple things at work there. Pride of Jacob, we talked about a couple weeks ago, is that the land, right? The promised land. So God has formerly, and 2 weeks ago in chapter 6, we talked about how God swears by God's own self, about what God is going to do. Here God swears by the land, right? By this thing that they thought was eternal, the thing that was God's to give and now is God's to take away. God swears by it and says, the more concerning part, I will never forget the sins of Jacob. This is God, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. God, of whom it is described, throws our sins into the sea of forgetfulness. God who forgave Israel when they rebelled at Sinai. God who forgave Israel when they rebelled. God who sent judges to bring the people on track. God who sent Samuel to Eli. God who continually forgave, God who forgave David his grave transgressions. God says, I will never forget the sins of Israel. Again, this isn't perhaps to talk about how harsh God is, but to remind us of how far things have come. Oftentimes, the prophets have appealed to God, who is abounding in steadfast love. And God relents. God has not overlooked, but God has forgiven some nasty, nasty things and said, okay, I'll give you another chance. Here God says, you will not receive another chance. I will not forget. I will not forget the sins of Israel. Again, many bodies everywhere, silence, right? It's supposed to be uncomfortable. This is hard to square with our image of God, right? Especially as Christians, God who is infinitely forgiving. But I don't know that it's so much about God's capacity or willingness to forgive as it is about just, there's times that come where people have gone so far that God has to do something for the sake of God's name. God has to do something, and that seems to be what's happening to me. To me, it seems to me what is happening here. And then Amos goes on to talk about, again, how this is going to happen, what's going to happen, talking about natural judgment, about the very land itself kind of acting as judge against the people, the shaking of the land, right, the reforming the land, it rising up and overflowing, right. The language is earthquake, and an earthquake happened around, near this time in Israel, at least as far as we can tell. So to me, I read there, this is operative of judgment, right? We see all along that God uses natural things to judge people, but again, I like to also think about it in the ways that the very land itself rises up against the people in judgment, right? That the land can no longer bear sort of the blood of those who are killed on the altar of injustice, and rises up itself against the people, right? The earth itself rising up against. I mean, we see this, and I think it's perhaps operative, perhaps talking about God's sovereignty over the earth, but various places of when there's sin, that the earth itself swallows up the people, right? That the earth acts and testifies into the righteousness of this judgment. But here there's judgment that is shown in nature, and nature itself, the earth itself becomes a mode of and a testimony of God's judgment against the people. So that's what's happening, and then it moves in and begins to talk about the sky becoming dark at noonday, and really what seems to be descriptive of. And again, we can trace this astronomically back to this particular period in history, in this particular time and place. That there was an eclipse that happened in this time and place, but there's kind of an eclipse language of the sky becoming dark, right? The sky becoming dark and the earth being dark in broad daylight. And again, the whole language of I will turn your religious feasts into mourning and all your singing into weeping. So it's interesting, the image of the sky becoming dark and the kind of the idea of eclipse happening, of the sun becoming dark is the opposite of what it should be, right? Or this reversal, right? We don't expect it to get dark in the middle of the day. Actually, when this picture was taken, was the eclipse that happened here in 2018, where it was so weird to experience this darkness and gloom in the middle of the day. It wasn't natural. It didn't feel right. Things had been shifted. It's off-putting, and it's scary when things aren't as they should be, even when we know why they aren't as they should be. But there's this description of these heavenly signs of this eclipse happening, and then at the same time, the prophet describes again the religious feasts, these things that are supposed to celebrate and worship God, being turned into times of lament and into mourning, right? So where things are reversed, where day becomes night, right? Rejoicing becomes sorrow. The empty religion of the people finally turns to the sorrow that it should be, but only after God has enacted judgment, and that's what's sad about it. Right? It's only as God enacts the judgment, only afterwards that people realize what's happened and begin to mourn over what has happened. It's sad to me as I read it. It's very sad, but God says this is what's going to happen. I will, these appointed people, these people who are, sitting on their ivory beds are now going to wear sackcloth. And God says, again, the scary nature, these things are things we don't expect God to say, but God says, I will make that time like mourning for an only son, and the end of it like a bitter day. I mean, these are heavy things. Think about the mourning that happened in Egypt when we hear about the plague of the firstborn son. Right? That kind of language is now operative, and that's the kind of mourning that's going to happen in Israel on account of this judgment. These are the consequences of their grave sin. Those who were rejoicing, eating the fat of the cow and drinking bowls of wine will now be wearing sackcloth and ash. Those who are elite, who were first, will be brought low and will be in mourning. The feasting shall be turned into mourning. Scary, gloomy stuff.
So we talk a lot about God's consistency of character and how he keeps his promises, how he's faithful. And those are all great things when we are in step with him. But how can that, all right, not sure how to phrase this question, but in this context, we recognize that for the Israelites, that characteristic of who God is might cause some panic, as well it should, I suppose. That's the point. So I guess where in our own lives, if we are to really sit back and reflect and examine, where do we see in our own lives that God's promise-keeping consistency of character might be something that causes us to squirm a little?
Yeah, it's interesting. God's consistency of grace is wonderful when we need grace, and God's consistency of dealing with injustice is very difficult when we perpetrate injustice. I think, going to the end of the book, sort of Revelation kind of has this language of warning for people who do not choose the way of the kingdom. And I think for us, it's important for us to remember that salvation is not a transaction. Meaning, salvation is not just, I said a prayer, I'm going to heaven. And then I can do whatever I want, right? Paul addresses that in Romans, right? What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning that grace may abound? By no means. I mean, he says it much stronger. Absolutely not. Because sin is the way of death, and the way of Christ is life. And when we are baptized, Paul says, this just happened to be on my mind because I'm thinking about preaching on it in 2 weeks, but when we're baptized with Christ, we are baptized into his death, raised to new life, to live as people of life. So to go back and sin, to live lives that are defined by sin or injustice or all these things, is to live the way of death. And what does Paul say? The wages of sin is death. And I don't take that to mean that for those who sin, God metes out death, but rather the way of sin, living a life of sin, is a life of death. Because it's apart from God, and God is life. Christ is life. Jesus says, I'm the way and the truth and life. So when we live in ways that are counter to that, it is the way of death, and it leads to death. It can only bring death in the end. And so for us, especially who are used to sort of what we might call cheap grace, is that it's okay if I sin because God's got my back. God will forgive me. And in some respects, that's true, right? If we do fall into sin, thanks be to God, we have an advocate. However, We are called to live new life. You are a new creation in Christ. The old things have gone. Behold, all things are new. Or, another way of putting it is, there is a way that leads to death, the way of death, and that is separation from Christ. That is living in the ways of the world. Living and sowing to all those things that bring death, anger, malice, hatred, right? All those things, those sow to death. Injustice, all that sows to death, brings death to others and brings death to us. But we follow the way of Christ, the crucified one, and that way brings life. Do we mess up? Sure. Do we stumble? Sure. Do we sometimes get it wrong intentionally? Sure. That is sin. But our desire is to walk in the way of life. I don't think we should read Amos as if these people just sort of messed up. They have chosen a way that is contrary to what God said is the way of life. And so it should not surprise us or them that it leads to death. So in the same way, if we have chosen to follow Christ, we will walk in the ways of Jesus. But if we choose the ways of death, again, injustice, of exploitation, of anger, hatred, of condemnation, right? All those things that Jesus talks about, tells us we aren't to do. If we follow that way, we are living in death. And we shouldn't be surprised that it brings death. Can God save us in the end? Maybe. Will God save us in the end? Well, certainly God has that prerogative. And God could. God's grace is sufficient. But we should not walk in death. Because death brings death. Not just to us in the end, but to everyone around us. Again, sin is not just about me. Me sinning does not just mean I mess up or I cause myself harm or I cause myself death. Sin has communal consequences. That's why absolute personal liberty doesn't work for Christians. I can do what I want. I am free to do whatever I want. In some respects, yes. I am not free to do what I want and have that not affect other people. My personal decisions will always, always affect people around me. So if you want to know why I'm in favor of vaccination, that's why. Not because people don't have the right to opt out, but because it's the tool we have that seems best for community. Or even this way, I'm vaccinated. If I get sick, and I'm sick at home and decide I can go into work today, that has consequences for the people around me. I don't care if it's coronavirus or the flu or a cold, right? It has consequences for the people around me. I may be sick, experiencing sickness, but that sickness spreads. And so if I'm not careful, stay at home when I'm seriously ill, whatever, right? Mitigate that. It has consequences. I'm not a public health expert, but that's how I see things like that. And so I think it's important for us to say we cannot use our liberty in ways that ignore the consequences of our personal liberty on those around us. Paul makes this argument about eating meat in 1 Corinthians, right? Can we eat meat? Sure. Does it matter if it's sacrificed to idols? No, not really. Idols are nothing. But it might cause another to stumble. And so Paul says, what? I will never eat meat again if it means that I will avoid causing others to stumble. Personal liberty could lead to the death of others, essentially is what he's saying. And so he is using his personal liberty to choose not to do something rather than to say, I can do anything I want. And if I'm honest with myself, personal liberty oftentimes to me means I can do whatever I want. Not I am at liberty to choose not to do some things that I absolutely am free to do for the sake of someone else. But that is what we are called to do in Christ. To give up our own personal liberties, or rather to use our liberty to make choices that benefit others. I can hoard all my money That is my right. Or I can, in the so-called words of John Wesley, whether he really said this, we don't know, make all you can, save all you can, give all you can. I choose to use my money for the sake of others. That's our choice, right? Goodness is never purely individual, and sin is never purely individual. I got off on a rabbit trail there, but that's what I'm getting at. Okay, moving on to the next chapter, to the next section. Words of life and death. So ultimately what happens is we've been told about, the earthquake, we've been told about an eclipse, right? Natural things that forestall judgment. And then Amos brings in here and he sneaks in a metaphor and he says, there'll be a famine too. But then he says, but it's not a famine of water or of crops, it's a famine of the word of the Lord. What makes the people of Israel unique, at least as God identifies it, is that God is with them. What has set the people of Israel apart for their history is that God has been with them and said, guess what? I'm with you. I will speak to you through my prophets. I will speak to you through all these sorts of things. But what Amos is prophesying here is that God is going to withdraw God's voice. Now, God's presence, I don't know. But functionally speaking, God is no longer going to communicate with God's people. Something God has done from the beginning. God's saying, I'm going to withdraw my voice or withdraw my presence from among the people. I will no longer speak to them through prophet or otherwise. What happens when God withdraws God's voice? It doesn't say this in the text, but it seems to indicate it. Chaos. When God withdraws God's voice, because God's voice calms the seas, God's voice brings order in the midst of chaos. When God withdraws God's presence or God's voice, there is chaos. If they thought things were bad now, right, just wait. God's going to withdraw God's voice. God has been speaking through the prophets, through Amos most recently, and the people have not listened. But now God's going to not speak, and things will go from bad to worse. What happens when the God they had always relied on in tragedy, what happens when God withdraws or does not answer? This is the first time in history that's been the case. We hear during the times of Eli, before Samuel, that the word of God was scarce, but not gone. What happens if God removes God's presence? That is a fearful, fearful thought, and that's what's going on. To the extent that the prophet says, even if they search for me, they may go to the coastlands, they may search high and low, they will not find me. The people didn't listen when God was speaking. But even coming up, if the people are willing to listen, God has already spoken and will say no more. I've counted to 10, and that's all I'm going to do, right? I've given you what's going on, and I've counted to 10. This is my word on the subject. I will speak on it no more. It sort of reminds me of Forrest Gump. That's all I have to say about that. Essentially, God is saying, I have spoken ad nauseum. I've said what I needed to say. I will say no more, which means that judgment and not grace is the last word, at least here in Amos, which is scary. We're not used to judgment being the last word for the people of God. But for the time being, that's what we're dealt with. That's what we're experiencing. The people who have so long ignored the voice of God, when they search for it now, they will not hear it. Even if they go through empty and vain worship, the prophet says. Now, we're not sure if at the end of 8, the prophet is speaking of worship of foreign deities, idols. They put some names there, right? The god of Beersheba. As surely as your God lives, O Dan. In the NIV, those God references are lowercase g. that hasn't been an issue. Like, Amos has not addressed idolatry at all yet. And so I think it's going back to this vain and empty worship where the people think that they're going through all the right motions in worship, but their lives are so wicked that it shows that they're speaking to nothing. And in this case, their appeals to God, which has, in every instance in the past when the people had turned back to God, God had relented or God had forgiven or God had spoken. Here, it's not going to happen. The people, for at least the time being, for all intents and purposes, are forsaken by God. This has not happened before. This is huge. It's devastating. And it's presented as if perhaps the people will search, but I'm not so hopeful. The biggest tragedy for me is not a people who God withdraws God's voice and then they turn to God. The biggest tragedy for me is the people who God removes God's presence and they don't notice. To me, that seems like what's happened in Israel. Ezekiel describes something similar in the temple, right? He describes this vision of the presence of God lifting up from the temple and going across the Kidron Valley and disappearing and kind of hovering over the Mount of Olives. And worship just goes on like normal. People don't notice. Nothing is more scary to me than the thought that God has left the building and none of us noticed. It honestly keeps me up, that idea keeps me up at night. What happened if God removed God's presence? Would we even notice? May it never be. Sheldon.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if this is a good question or not, but that gets me thinking that, I guess, just to take exactly what you were saying and to apply it to our own personal lives, of how would our daily routines, our weekly routines change if God had removed his presence? Like, in what areas of our lives would we notice that? Perhaps a better question is, what areas would we notice it the most?
I mean, the scariest thought is that I wouldn't notice. I went through a long period in my life where I couldn't stand worship music because there were times where I felt, and again, this may have been judgment, but this is what I was feeling in my heart. There were times where we would sing something and I'd go, I don't think we really know what we're singing or care. I think we like the song. I don't think we're singing it to God. Wasn't here, by the way, earlier in my life. But I really began to wonder if we were singing to ourselves and that God had left the building and we hadn't noticed because we were too busy making ourselves happy, giving ourselves sort of spiritual pleasure. And that's what scares me. You know, again, we go to great lengths at this church to plan worship and music in worship in ways that are intentional to the text, intentional to what we're trying to understand, or at least hearing about God to help us hear from God rather than just do things that make us happy. Which means oftentimes people aren't happy with some of the songs we sing, right? I don't like that song. Well, I'm not singing it to you is really the answer to that question. I never want to get into the place where we are singing music or preaching sermons or doing anything for the sake of making people happy. Now, worship ought to make us joyful, but the primary reason we worship is not for us. Worship is for God. And so in some respects, it's immaterial whether I like it or not. And that's why so-called right worship is important, because it's not for me. If right worship were defined by what I like, we'd do things very, very differently at this church. I like things that not a lot of people like in worship, right? But it's not about me or my preferences even. It's about God. How do we offer right worship to God that's appropriate for the context in which we are? So what would happen if God withdrew God's presence? Would we notice? Sometimes I look around to the church in the world, or in this country in particular, and say, I'm not sure we would notice. I don't writ large. In my more prophetic and judgmental days, that's what I think. I think for me, those profound experiences with God are not as I'm singing. They're generally in the silence, when I'm just at my wit's end and God says and speaks something to me in the silence. It's not generally something that makes me always feel better, but it might just be I am devastated and God says, yet I'm here. If I were to lay in the middle of this sanctuary some night in that place and God not answer, I would be very scared. Because generally it's not God that's moved, it's me, right? As it was here, right? That God doesn't withdraw because God is capricious. God withdraws because the people just aren't listening. It's them. And God essentially says, you don't want to listen, I won't speak. It's not pouting. God's just saying, you're not listening, and you haven't listened, and you don't want to listen. So I'm not going to speak. And again, we're not sure that people notice. Which is why I want to say to everyone listening, don't just do things spiritually that make you happy or comfortable. Read things that make you uncomfortable. Read the prophets. I mean, I am so very uncomfortable preaching or talking through Amos. It's been difficult. And also pause to listen. Right? If we're always the one doing the talking or the singing and not the listening, then there's a problem. If you're never challenged by the scriptures, if I'm never challenged by the scriptures, I'm not sure I'm listening. If I don't see myself somewhere, I see myself some of these places in Amos, and that's what scares me. But that's good, because that's the Spirit saying, don't go down this road. The things that make us feel uncomfortable are hopefully the things in which God is saying, adjust this, make sure you don't go here, or this is a blind area, make sure you course correct. So please, ask yourself, if God were to withdraw God's voice, would I notice? And then more proactively say, how can I make room in my life? How can we make room in our worship? How can we make sure that we are pausing to truly listen to the voice of God in our midst, through the scriptures, through the text, to make us uncomfortable, to help us to align more fully and truly with the way and the will of God. So that's the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9's next week, and then we'll be done with Amos. Please don't expect it to end on a lighter note, because I don't think it's going to happen. There's a little bit about Israel's restoration in the end, so hopefully we'll have some good news. But thank you for being here. Go in the presence of God. Go and listen for the voice of God this week. Read chapter 9 for next week, and we will see you next Wednesday.